If you really want to understand one of the absolute most brilliant design concepts in nature, you've got to look really, really closely, like microscopic. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to break down the fundamental differences between plant and animal cells. Now, I know on the surface these two types of cells might seem kind of similar, but they actually tell this incredibly cool story about evolutionary adaptation. The big overarching idea we're going to unpack today is how cellular structure perfectly, and I mean perfectly, adapts to an organism's lifestyle. We're going to see exactly how every single microscopic part has a distinct purpose. It just completely proves that in the natural world, form absolutely always follows function.
So picture this for a second. How does a giant tree, like think of a towering oak or one of those massive redwoods, how does it stand perfectly tall without a single bone in its body? I mean, think about the immense gravitational pressure that's just pulling down on it every second of every single day. Think about the howling winds, the sheer weight of its branches stretching way up into the sky, the torrential rains. It just sits there and endures season after season, and yet it stands there, firmly anchored, totally upright, with zero skeleton whatsoever. No bones at all. I want you to keep that fascinating little scientific reality in the back of your mind right now, because as we unpack the deep architectural differences between these cells, the answer to this massive structural mystery is going to become brilliantly clear.
Okay, let's dive right in. To really grasp these architectural differences, we obviously need to start at the foundation of life itself. We all know the basics, right? The cell is the fundamental building block of all living organisms. Whether we're talking about a blade of grass blowing in a meadow, a lion stalking its prey, or literally the hand you're using right now, it all starts right here. But it really helps to think of the cell not just as this boring, static, microscopic brick, but actually as a bustling, highly engineered city. It's this incredibly dynamic metropolis. It's got its own intricate inner workings, specific machinery, dedicated pathways, all just tirelessly operating 24/7 to keep the organism alive and thriving.
Now, both plant and animal cells actually share a lot of this essential municipal infrastructure, so to speak. They both rely on a core set of organelles just to survive. So let's quickly walk through this shared cellular machinery. First up, you've got the nucleus. Think of this as the command and control center of the cell. It's securely holding all the critical DNA and the genetic blueprints you need to run the entire operation. Then there's the cell membrane. This is basically the border regulator. It's a highly selective, protective envelope wrapping around the cell, strictly controlling what vital materials are allowed in and what waste gets kicked out. Inside that boundary, you have the cytoplasm. This is this crazy, jelly-like fluid where all the other organelles kind of just float and interact, creating a suspended environment for all that cellular traffic. And finally, look, you cannot have a bustling city without a reliable source of power. So that is the mitochondria, the cell's dedicated power plant, endlessly generating the chemical energy required for literally every single activity the cell performs.
But right here is where the biological paths completely diverge, and where lifestyle entirely dictates structure. Let's look at the outer boundaries. In plant cells, there's this super thick outer layer called the cell wall. It's made of tough cellulose, and it is specifically engineered to provide rigid, fixed structural support. Animal cells? They completely lack this rigid wall. Their boundary is just that flexible, dynamic cell membrane we were just talking about. So why such a stark difference? Well, think about how they live in the real world. A plant is completely tethered to its environment, right? It's stationary. It absolutely needs rigid structural support to reach upward for sunlight without just collapsing under its own weight. Animals, on the other hand, require a highly mobile, incredibly flexible lifestyle to hunt, forage, evade predators, and just survive out there. The stiff, rigid wall of a plant would make the fluid, kinetic movement of an animal practically impossible.
And this brilliant evolutionary logic brings us directly to our next major difference: chloroplasts. Plant cells contain these highly specialized little organelles specifically to perform photosynthesis. Because, again, a plant is tethered to its environment. It doesn't have the luxury of roaming around, foraging, or hunting for a meal. It has to manufacture its own energy on site, literally using ambient sunlight to synthesize its own food, exactly where it stands. Animal cells absolutely do not have chloroplasts. Since animals are heterotrophic, which is just a fancy way of saying they do not produce their own food, they simply don't need the cellular machinery for it. We acquire our energy externally by, eating other organisms. Once again, it's just a beautiful demonstration of microscopic form perfectly following macro-level function.
Okay, let's move to the next adaptation, which is all about resource management and storage. Cells constantly need to store water, nutrients, and even waste materials, and they do this in these organelles called vacuoles. Now, in a typical plant cell, you are going to find one massive central vacuole. And I mean massive. It can sometimes take up to 90% of the cell's entire internal volume.
It acts as this giant pressurized reservoir. Animal cells, conversely, feature small, scattered, and multiple storage spaces. And the reasoning here is just brilliant. Because a plant cannot uproot itself and hike over to a nearby river during a drought, its cells have structurally adapted to hoard massive amounts of water internally just to survive prolonged dry spells. Animals, we can physically travel to a water source when we're thirsty, so our cellular storage needs are much more modest, temporary, and distributed throughout the cell. So, all these internal organelles end up dictating the entire macrostructure. When you observe plant cells under a microscope, their appearance is highly organized. Constrained by that thick, rigid cell wall we discussed earlier, they take on these regular, geometric shapes, often rectangular or hexagonal. They stack tightly together, locking into place almost like masonry or bricks in a sturdy architectural wall. Animal cells, because they are totally unrestricted by a rigid outer casing, are completely different. Since they only possess a soft, pliable cell membrane, they exist in this fluid, organic variability. Their shapes are incredibly irregular, mostly circular, and they can actually change depending on their highly specific job within the animal's complex body. The rigid, stationary lifestyle naturally creates a rigid, uniform shape. The fluid, active lifestyle creates a flexible, highly adaptable shape. It makes perfect sense. So, when we pull all these distinct features together and really look at the big picture, the dichotomy of nature's design becomes incredibly stark. The absolute crucial point to take away from this is, while both cellular blueprints rely on shared machinery, the nucleus, mitochondria, cytoplasm, just to run the basic functions of life, it's their specialized adaptations that truly define them. The plant cell is entirely characterized by its thick cell wall for structural integrity, chloroplasts for localized energy production, a giant single vacuole for intense drought resistance, and a regular, locked-in geometric shape. The animal cell, it's defined by the complete absence of a rigid cell wall, a total lack of chloroplasts, much smaller and scattered vacuoles, and an organically variable, irregular shape optimized for movement. Seeing the logic laid out side by side like this really highlights just how meticulously engineered these microscopic cities truly are.
Which brings us right back to our opening mystery. How does a towering tree stand perfectly upright without a single bone in its body? Well, the secret bones of a tree are exactly what we've been unpacking this whole time: strong cell walls. The reason that massive redwoods stand so firmly against a howling wind is thanks to millions upon millions of those individual plant cells. Each one is encased in a thick, unyielding layer of cellulose, stacking firmly on top of one another, like microscopic, indestructible bricks. The sheer scale of it is just staggering. The collective, combined strength of millions of those microscopic cell walls provides all the massive structural support the tree requires to push tons of wood and leaves hundreds of feet into the canopy. It is a fantastic, awe-inspiring scientific reality hiding right there in plain sight, proving that true strength often comes from the smallest possible foundations.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a quick final thought experiment to really test your understanding of how deeply form intertwines with function. What if human cells suddenly developed chloroplasts and strong cell walls? How would our lives change? Really think about the physical implications of that for a second. Would we have to stand out in the blazing sun all day just to synthesize a meal? Would we even be able to bend our arms, walk down the street, or breathe if our soft tissues were suddenly bound by rigid, rectangular walls of stiff cellulose? It is a totally bizarre, mind-bending scenario for sure, but it truly underscores just how perfectly and how delicately our current cellular biology is suited to our dynamic, active human lives. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, keep looking closely at the world around you, and I'll catch you next time.